There is an invisible force always moving within every human being. It has no shape, no sound, yet it holds the power to shape nearly an entire life. That force is desire. It appears very early, even before a person understands themselves. A child reaches out toward a toy. An adult pursues success. A soul seeks love, recognition, or a sense of wholeness it cannot name. In whatever form it takes, desire is always present, like a quiet but continuous current. At first glance, desire seems to be the driving force of life. Because of desire, people learn, grow, create, and move forward. Without desire, there would be no movement. Without desire, life might become so still that it turns motionless. Yet at the same time, desire is also the source of much unease. Where there is desire, there is expectation. Where there is expectation, there is the possibility of disappointment. Where there is attachment, there is fear of loss. And where there is fear, the mind is never truly at rest. What is striking is that desire never truly ends by obtaining what it wants. In the moment of achieving what is desired, there may be satisfaction, there may be joy. But that joy often does not last. After a short while, the mind begins searching again for the next thing. A new goal. A new experience. A new state. It is like drinking seawater, the more you drink, the thirstier you become. Not because there is not enough water, but because its nature cannot quench the deeper thirst. In Buddhist teachings, desire is not seen as a mistake to be eliminated through force. Instead, it is regarded as a phenomenon to be understood. Because only when it is clearly understood does its true nature begin to reveal itself. Desire is not only a wish for material things. It may be the desire to be recognized, the desire to feel safe, the desire to become someone different from who one currently is. On a deeper level, it may be the desire to escape inner unease, a sense of lack that many carry without realizing it. Most people live without truly recognizing how they are driven by desire. They feel an impulse and act upon it. They believe that if they achieve what they want, they will feel whole. But even when they achieve it, that sense of wholeness often does not last. A new emptiness appears. And the cycle continues. This cycle is not a sign of personal failure. It is part of how the mind operates when it is not clearly understood. The mind always turns outward in search of completion because it believes completion does not exist within. It believes something is missing, and that it must be found somewhere in the future. But there is a question that is rarely asked: what truly creates this sense of lack? Does it really come from not having achieved enough, or does it come from the way the mind perceives itself? When this question begins to be explored, a new door starts to open. One begins to realize that desire is not only a reaction to the outer world, but also a reaction to the inner state. When there is unease, desire appears as a way to escape that unease. When there is emptiness, desire appears as a way to fill the void. But if the true source lies within, then no external object can completely resolve it. This does not mean that all desire is wrong, or that life must become entirely without goals. Instead, it opens the possibility of living without being enslaved by desire. A state in which action still occurs, but is no longer driven by a sense of deficiency. A state in which a person no longer seeks in order to become whole, but acts from the wholeness that is already present. This is where understanding begins to bring freedom. Not freedom from having desire, but freedom from being controlled by it. When desire is clearly seen, it loses its ability to operate in the dark. It is no longer an invisible force governing every decision, but becomes a phenomenon that can be observed, that can be understood. And within that understanding, a new stillness begins to emerge. Not the stillness of having no desire, but the stillness of no longer being swept away by desire. A stillness that does not depend on gaining or losing, but exists as a deeper foundation beneath every movement of the mind. Understanding the nature of desire is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of an entirely different way of living, a way of living no longer driven by deficiency, but illuminated by awareness. And from this awareness, the path toward true inner freedom begins to unfold. To truly understand the nature of desire, one must first see how it is born in the mind. Desire does not appear randomly. It often begins with a very subtle feeling, a sense that the present moment, as it is not enough. This feeling can be so faint it is almost unnoticeable. But from there, the mind begins to create an image of a better state. A future where everything becomes more complete, more pleasant, more whole. And the moment that image is formed, desire has been born. At its deepest level, desire is not merely the wish to obtain something. It is the movement of the mind away from the present, toward an idea of perfection. It whispers, right now is not enough. But if this is achieved, everything will be okay. And in that moment, a separation appears, the separation between what is and what should be. It is this separation that creates tension. Not because the present has a problem, but because the mind has left it. What is striking is that desire always carries the promise of ending unease, yet it rarely keeps that promise. When a desire is fulfilled, there may be a moment of relief. But that relief does not come from the object of desire, it comes from the temporary ending of desire. In that moment, the mind stops seeking. It stops moving. And in that temporary stillness, natural peace appears. But because this is not recognized, the mind attributes that peace to the object that was just attained. It believes that object created the peace. And so, the cycle of seeking continues. This cycle becomes an endless loop. Not because life is never enough, but because the mind has become accustomed to seeking as a way of existing. It becomes addicted to the feeling of moving forward, addicted to the sense that something ahead is waiting to bring completion. But this constant leaning forward causes one to miss the wholeness that is already present. When observed more deeply, it can be seen that desire is often not so much about a specific object, but about the feeling that object promises to bring. A person does not merely want an achievement, but the feeling of worth. A person does not merely want recognition, but the feeling of being seen. A person does not merely want security, but the feeling of no longer being afraid. This shows that desire is not truly directed toward the outer world, but toward changing an inner state. But there is a profound paradox here. When desire arises from a sense of lack, everything gained from that state carries the imprint of that lack. Even after attaining what is desired, the mind still carries the same structure that created the original desire. And so, it will continue to generate new desires. Not because the world is insufficient, but because the mind has not yet recognized its own true nature. It is precisely at this point that mindful observation begins to bring transformation. When a desire appears, instead of immediately chasing it or resisting it, one can simply observe it. Observe its sensation in the body. Observe how it creates images in the mind. Observe how it promises a better future. And most importantly, observe the sense of lack it is trying to fill. When observed without judgment, something remarkable begins to happen. Desire loses part of its power. Not because it is forced to disappear, but because the light of awareness dissolves the illusion that it must be pursued. It becomes just a movement in the mind, like a cloud drifting across the sky. Through this process, a deep understanding begins to form. The understanding that desire is not an enemy, but it is not a master either. It is simply a phenomenon. It appears, and it disappears. It does not define a person. It does not control a person, unless it goes unrecognized. And when this is clearly seen, a new kind of freedom begins to emerge. This is not freedom from having desires, but freedom from being carried away by every desire. The ability to feel a desire without needing to act on it. The ability to let it come and go, without losing inner stability. From this freedom, action becomes more pure. No longer arising from lack, but from clarity. No longer arising from insecurity, but from understanding. And in this state, life is no longer an endless chain of seeking, but becomes a natural flow, a flow not driven by deficiency, but guided by deep awareness. Desire, when not clearly understood, becomes a silent source of much suffering in human life. It does not cause pain immediately in an obvious way, but operates more subtly. It creates a continuous sense of lack, a feeling that the present is not enough, that something is still missing, that true happiness still lies ahead. And it is this sense of lack that prevents the mind from ever truly resting. One of the deepest harms of desire is that it takes away the ability to live fully in the present. When the mind is caught in desire, it is always oriented toward the future. It is always thinking about the next thing to achieve, the next state to attain, the next version to become. But in the process, the present moment is reduced to merely a means, no longer a place to live. Life becomes an endless movement toward, without ever truly arriving. This creates a prolonged state of tension. Even when there is no real external threat, an inner unease remains. Because desire always carries with it its opposing fear, the fear of not achieving, the fear of losing, the fear of not being enough. When there is a desire for success, there is a fear of failure. When there is a desire to be loved, there is a fear of rejection. When there is a desire for security, there is a fear of instability. Desire and fear are two sides of the same movement. The mind, when dominated by desire, also becomes more vulnerable. It becomes dependent on external circumstances in order to feel stable. When things go as desired, there is temporary satisfaction. But when things do not unfold as expected, disappointment appears. And because life inherently cannot always go according to one's wishes, disappointment becomes a recurring part of experience. Another harm of desire is that it creates mistaken identification. A person begins to believe that they are what they desire. They believe their worth depends on what they achieve, what they possess, or how others perceive them. This creates a fragile identity, one that constantly needs reinforcement from outside. And when that reinforcement is no longer present, a sense of disorientation arises. Desire also clouds the clarity of perception. When the mind is covered by strong wanting, it no longer sees reality as it is, but sees reality through the lens of what it wants. It interprets everything in a way that serves its desire. This leads to decisions that do not arise from understanding, but from unconscious impulse. At a deeper level, desire sustains a cycle of never being enough. Each time a desire is fulfilled, the mind feels satisfied only briefly, then quickly adapts to the new state. What was once a great longing becomes ordinary. And then a new desire appears to replace it. This cycle continues, not because there is something wrong with the world, but because the mind has become accustomed to seeking as a way to fill an inner void. This void cannot be filled by any external object, because it is not truly a material emptiness. It is a lack of connection with one's own presence. And when this lack of connection exists, no achievement, no possession, no experience can bring lasting fulfillment. Desire also weakens inner freedom. When a person believes they need something in order to feel whole, they become dependent on it. And wherever there is dependence, there is bondage. Freedom is not lost because of circumstances, but because of the belief that happiness depends on circumstances. This does not mean that all desires must be eliminated. The issue is not the existence of desire, but the unconsciousness toward it. When desire is not clearly seen, it operates as an invisible force, directing thoughts, emotions, and actions without being recognized. It creates a life driven by constant seeking, rather than by understanding. And perhaps the greatest harm of desire is that it obscures the peace that is already present. Peace is not something that needs to be created, but something that is discovered when the continuous movement of desire settles down. But when the mind is always oriented outward, always seeking the next thing, it never pauses long enough to recognize that peace. Like water that is constantly stirred cannot clearly reflect the sky, a mind constantly stirred by desire cannot recognize its own still nature. Not because stillness does not exist, but because it is covered by continuous movement. When this is clearly seen, a natural transformation begins to occur. It is not a forced renunciation of desire, but an understanding that gradually diminishes its power. And in that understanding, the mind begins to return to its natural state, a state not driven by lack, not bound by seeking, and no longer veiled by the illusion that happiness exists somewhere outside this very presence. Desire cannot be resolved through resistance, because resistance itself is another form of desire, the desire to be free from desire. This is a subtle paradox that many people do not recognize. The more one tries to force oneself not to want, the more tense the mind becomes. It creates inner conflict, and that conflict further feeds unease. Therefore, the true path does not lie in eliminating desire through willpower, but in clearly understanding its nature through deep awareness. The first step in transformation is learning to observe desire the moment it appears. Not after it has already dominated action, but in the very first instant it forms. It may be a very subtle impulse, a thought that something is needed, that something must be achieved, or that the present moment must be changed. Instead of immediately chasing it, simply pause and recognize, this is desire. That recognition alone begins to create a new space. Within that space, something important is revealed: desire is not who you truly are. It is merely a movement in the mind. It comes, and it will go, if it is not fed by unconscious identification. When this is clearly seen, desire loses its power of absolute control. It is no longer a command that must be obeyed, but becomes a phenomenon that can be calmly observed. Another important practice is returning to the direct experience of the present. Desire always exists in the future. It always promises that something ahead will bring completion. But life itself only exists in the present. When attention is brought back to the breath, back to the sensations of the body, back to the sounds and space around, the mind gradually leaves the inertia of constant seeking. It begins to recognize that this moment, as it is, lacks nothing. Over time, this practice creates a profound shift. The mind no longer reacts automatically to every desire. A stillness appears before action. And within that stillness, natural intelligence begins to function. Action no longer arises from unconscious impulse, but from clarity. This does not make life passive, on the contrary, it makes action more precise and harmonious. Another essential element in transforming desire is understanding the impermanent nature of all experiences. Every feeling gained from fulfilling desire is temporary. When this is seen clearly not only intellectually but through direct experience, the mind naturally loosens its attachment. Not because it is forced to let go, but because it realizes there is nothing that can be held forever. As desire gradually loses its dominating power, deep benefits begin to emerge. The first benefit is a profound sense of relief. The mind is no longer stretched between what is and what it wants to become. There is a sense of wholeness in the simplicity of the present. The subtle tension that once existed in the background of consciousness begins to dissolve. Another benefit is inner freedom. When no longer controlled by desire, a person is no longer dependent on circumstances to feel at peace. They do not need everything to unfold according to their wishes in order to feel stable. Stability comes from within, no longer dependent on the ever-changing conditions outside. Clarity in perception also deepens. When the mind is no longer covered by constant seeking, it begins to see reality more directly. Decisions become simpler, because they are no longer distorted by fear or lack. There is a natural sense of trust in life, a sense that there is no need to control everything in order to feel safe. Relationships also change in a profound way. When no longer seeking others to fill an inner void, a person begins to connect from wholeness, not from lack. This creates authenticity and freedom in how they are present with others. No more clinging, no more fear of loss, only presence and understanding. Deeper still, a kind of independent peace begins to arise. This is not a fragile peace that can be broken by circumstances. It is the peace that comes from no longer being carried away by the continuous movement of desire. It is like the depth of the ocean, though the surface may fluctuate, the depth remains still. And perhaps the greatest benefit is the return to one's true nature. When desire no longer veils perception, a person begins to realize that they were never truly lacking anything. The sense of deficiency that once existed was merely a product of a mind not yet clearly understood. When understanding appears, a natural sense of completeness appears with it. From this state, life is no longer a race to become, but becomes a natural expression of presence. No longer driven by lack, but guided by awareness. No longer bound by seeking, but opened into deep and enduring freedom. There is a very subtle truth that only when a person truly stops and looks deeply into themselves do they begin to recognize. What they have always been seeking through desire was never actually in the objects they pursued. It is not in achievement, not in recognition, not in any fleeting experience. What they truly seek is a sense of wholeness, a sense of fullness. A sense that there is no longer any need to become anything other than this very presence. But throughout life, the mind has been trained to believe that this wholeness lies ahead. It always whispers that just one more step, just one more achievement, just becoming one better version, and finally peace will arrive. And because of this belief, people have spent most of their lives chasing images created by their own minds. Not because they are weak, but because they were never shown that what they are looking for has never left them. Desire, when not understood, creates a search with no ending point. But when it is clearly seen, when its nature is understood through direct observation, something begins to change. Not because a person forces themselves to give up desire, but because they begin to realize they no longer need to be led by it. They begin to recognize that peace is not the reward of attainment, but the natural ground that appears when seeking settles down. In this moment, a very deep freedom begins to open. Not the freedom to obtain everything, but the freedom from the feeling of needing everything in order to be whole. This is a fundamental shift in how a person experiences life. Life is no longer a series of goals to accomplish in order to feel enough, but becomes a flow of moments lived fully. No longer covered by a sense of lack. When desire is no longer the center of existence, the mind begins to return to its natural state, a state that is still yet alive, peaceful yet aware. In this state, there is still action, still creativity, still growth, but none of it arises from lack. It arises from wholeness. An action that arises from wholeness always carries harmony, not tension or fear. A person begins to realize that they do not need to control everything to feel safe. They do not need to secure the future to feel at peace. They do not need to become an ideal image to feel worthy. Because worth does not come from what they achieve, but from their own conscious presence. There is a very deep beauty in this realization. A beauty that does not depend on circumstances, does not depend on success or failure. It is the beauty of inner freedom. A freedom that cannot be taken away by time, by change, or by anything external. Because it is not built on things that can be lost, but on the understanding of the true nature of the mind. And when this understanding begins to take root, life no longer feels like a struggle. Even when difficulties arise, there remains something inside that is unmoved. Even when loss occurs, there remains a stillness that is not broken. Not because a person becomes indifferent, but because they are no longer completely swept away by the movements on the surface of experience. Just as the sky is not harmed by the clouds passing through, the true nature of the mind is not harmed by desires that appear and disappear. When this is clearly seen, a deep trust in life begins to form. There is no longer a feeling of needing to rush, no longer a feeling of having to achieve something in order to complete oneself. There is only life, unfolding, whole in itself. And perhaps, right now, as these lines are being read, there is a very simple yet profound opportunity present. An opportunity to pause, even for a few seconds. An opportunity to notice the breath happening without effort. An opportunity to feel presence without needing to become anything else. In that pause, it can be recognized that peace has never been absent. It was only covered by the continuous movement of seeking. And when seeking temporarily settles, even for a brief moment, true nature begins to reveal itself, still, clear, and free. This is not the end point of a journey, but the beginning of a new way of living. A way of living no longer driven by the illusion of lack, but illuminated by awareness. A way of living in which each moment is no longer a means to achieve something else, but the full expression of life itself. And in that awareness, a person finally finds what they have always been seeking, not somewhere far away, but right here. In the very stillness of a mind no longer bound. On the path of understanding and transforming desire, the most important thing is not to attain some perfect state, but to begin with very small, very sincere steps. No one can immediately be free from all desires, because desire has been part of the structure of the mind for many years, even many decades. But freedom does not come from eliminating all desires at once. It comes from gradually seeing them more clearly, understanding them more deeply, and no longer allowing them to unconsciously control life. Therefore, may each person from this moment begin to practice not through force, but through gentle observation. When a desire appears, there is no need to resist it, nor any need to immediately chase it. Just pause for a moment, and recognize that it is there. Recognize its feeling. Recognize the way it promises something in the future. And most importantly, recognize that you are still here, still whole, even if that desire is not fulfilled. Over time, this simple practice will begin to bring about a profound change. Desires that once seemed strong and irresistible will gradually become lighter. Not because they disappear completely, but because identification with them begins to dissolve. A new space is formed, a space that allows the mind to breathe, that allows stillness to appear between impulses. And in that stillness, a new kind of peace begins to be felt. Not a peace that comes from having everything, but a peace that comes from no longer needing everything in order to feel whole. This is a very subtle change, yet also a very deep one. It is like putting down a burden that one did not even realize was being carried. May each person gradually learn to be content with simple things. A deep breath. A quiet moment. A morning not driven by haste. These things may seem small, but it is in these small things that the mind begins to rediscover its natural balance. Desire always pulls the mind toward grand things in the future, but peace is always present in what is. As the practice continues, an inner freedom will gradually take shape. There is no longer a feeling of having to chase every opportunity in order to feel worthy. There is no longer a feeling of having to achieve every goal in order to feel complete. Instead, there is a deep inner stability, a sense that this life, as it is, already carries wholeness within it. This does not mean that life will no longer have challenges. There will still be moments when desire appears strongly, still moments when the mind feels uneasy. But the difference is that now, there is awareness. And that awareness itself is light. When there is light, darkness no longer has the same power to control. May each person be patient with themselves in this process. True transformation does not happen overnight. It happens gradually, through small yet sincere moments of wakefulness. Each time a desire is recognized without being carried away by it is a step toward freedom. Each time one returns to the present is a step away from suffering. And then, one day will come when the mind no longer feels stretched between what is and what it wants to become. A day when peace is no longer something distant, but becomes the natural foundation of life. Not because life has completely changed, but because the way of seeing has changed. No longer seeing life through the lens of lack, but through clarity and understanding. May each person on this journey gradually lay down unnecessary burdens. Not through force, but through understanding. Not by rejecting life, but by harmonizing with it. And when desire is no longer the center, suffering also gradually loses its foundation. Finally, may each person realize that peace is not a destination at the end of the road. It is something that has always been present, waiting to be recognized in this very moment. And when that is clearly seen, the journey is no longer a search, but becomes a return to oneself. A return to the stillness that has never left.